Following their victories in the European theater and later Pacific theater, the United Kingdom and our allies were left with the remnants of the Axis navies, namely the German Kriegsmarine, the Italian Regia Marina, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, of which, in the time-honored tradition of victorious nations, the Allies divided up those remnants between them, with the British receiving some interesting ships, albeit not as flashy as their American or Soviet counterparts. In today's video, we will go over some of the larger vessels acquired by the United Kingdom following the Second World War and their respective fates. The British, and more specifically the Royal Navy, had been fighting the Axis forces since 1939, and at least in the European theater, at one point, were facing them alone. As the war drew to a close, quite a few German ships were remaining, from U-boats to heavy cruisers like the Prinz Eugen, of which the Royal Navy had captured quite a few of the remaining German vessels, including Prinz Eugen and the light cruiser Nuremberg in Copenhagen, along with the remains of the Admiral Hipper, Admiral Scheer, and Emden and Kiel, to name a few. Of course, as I mentioned, there was much smaller craft that they captured, just to be even more clear. It's rather annoying to list them all off, but to the victors goes the spoils. So they were going to have to figure out how to divide everything up. Although I think it's interesting to note for Prinz Eugen in this period, the cruiser was visited by numerous high-ranking Royal Navy officers. It proved a magical attraction, especially for naval engineers in the Western powers. The remains of the German fleet were to be divided amongst the victorious powers. For example, the cruiser Nuremberg and the gunnery target ship Hessen were eventually ceded to the Soviet Union. Prinz Eugen, on the other hand, was the creme de la creme of the remaining surface units, and everybody wanted her. The USSR because of its attempts to purchase the vessel in 1939, and a sort of prize for the bombardment of its forces during the last year of the war. The British wanted her, in part, for a role in sinking HMS Hood, and the Americans wanted her for her technology, if that's to be believed. And one of the only reasons to have her was to keep her away from the Soviets. After much debate on how to decide who got the ships, lots were drawn. The lots were Lot X, Prinz Eugen, one Type 1936A destroyer, and 5 other destroyer/torpedo boats. Lot Y, which had Nuremberg, 4 Type 1936A destroyers, 6 other destroyers/torpedo boats. Lot Z, 8 Type 1936 destroyers, 5 other destroyers and torpedo boats. To take from Dodson and Kant again, it was not until October 29th that the British were prepared to go ahead based on the luck of the draw, and later that day the draw took place. To the consternation of the British and the Soviets, both keen to get Prinz Eugen, Lot X fell to the Americans, Lot Y went to the USSR, and Z to the UK. The results were enshrined in the final report of the TNC, signed December 6, 1945. The Americans had won, and on December 14, 1945, Prinz Eugen arrived at Bremerhaven, then an American exclave within the British zone of occupation. With that, the British had gotten the short end of the stick when it comes to the lots. So what were the ships the British got? Well, they got Z-10 Lady, Z-25, Z-31, Z-38, and T-108, of which they were the seaworthy ones, although Z-10 and T-108 had some minor issues. Z-4, Z-5, Z-6, and Z-30 all required significant work. The latter included a new stern. Z-38 happened to be in UK waters already, that is, of early 1946. Z-19, Z-25, T-23, and T-108 sailed for Portsmouth on January 6, 1946. Z-6 Jacobi left for Rosyth on the 16th, in company with the escort vessel F-4, the seaplane tender Volta Holzstaffel, and the experimental torpedo firing ship ex Costa Frida Peters, followed a few days later by Z-6. The immobilized Z-30 and Z-4 were towed from Oslo, Norway to Rosyth in early February. Before we continue, I think it's important to note something from Kant and Dodson. The UK had no interest in the long-term employment of ex-enemy vessels, only wishing to run trials with a few of the more technically interesting examples. These comprised ships with high-pressured boilers, submarines with high underwater speeds, and minesweepers with Foyt propulsors. Thus, most were intended for early scrapping or sinking. The exceptions are German units that the UK reallocated to France, and other allies excluded from the Potsdam share-out. such vessels being transferred as soon as possible after having been formally taken over by the UK. In doing so, the Admiralty fell foul of UK Treasury procedures since the ex-German ships had become British assets and thus should have been written off through Treasury minutes, which did not occur. Accordingly, a reprimand was issued by the Treasury in August 1947 when a similar retransfer of surrendered Japanese tonnage was being considered. I included that last little bit because I found it interesting as an accountant. Anyway, at the end of December 1945, the plan was that Z-10 and Z-38 would be used for long-term trials, to last up to 2 years, with Z-4 and Z-30 acting as spare parts donors, to become targets after stripping. T-23 would be used for more basic trials and then join the remaining modern vessels in being given to France. Her condition was judged to be too poor, and she just joined the main group heading to France. Z-4, on the other hand, was in what can be described as a piss-poor condition, including bottom damage from near misses, and had to be beached in December 1946 to avoid sinking, being added to the disposal list the following month, and she was scrapped in 1949. Z-30 was fit to be taken to Lochstriven, where various surplus ships were being employed to determine the effects of underwater explosions. Between May and September 1948, 3 charges were detonated at various depths below her hull, and despite some damage, she remained intact and was handed over for scrapping following the trials. Before I forget, some of the vessels I mentioned previously in Kiel, like the Emden, Admiral Scheer, and Admiral Hipper, were far beyond any repair, and according to the Potsdam Agreement, were a Category C ship, i.e. designated to be scrapped, and so they were scrapped over the coming years. Back to the destroyers. Proposed trials were cut back, and Z-10 was used as a training hulk for high-pressure boilers until October 1946, when she became an accommodation ship at the Thornycroft Yard at Southampton until declared for disposal in January 1949. Z-38 was used for initial trials in the Clyde, but then was laid up at Portsmouth until being brought into refit in November 1946, then renamed Nonsuch, and in the summer of 1947 became a trial ship for high-pressure machinery and also an air target ship, based on Rosyth. She was placed in the reserve in October 1948, and in March 1949 she was employed in the Lochstriven underwater explosion trials. These left her with a broken back and all her boiler rooms flooded by October. Subsequently, she was beached and sold for scrap, with the rear being refloated and the forward part of the ship being scrapped in situ. We'll discuss the submarines in a future video, as I think they deserve one of their own. There were even smaller mine warfare vessels, coastal forces, and auxiliary vessels allocated to the UK, but none were extremely interesting, with a few exceptions of course. In particular, the boat S-30 still exists today, and is one of the last remaining such vessels today. Another interesting vessel is the auxiliary vessel Nordmark, the ex-Vestavald, where she was also captured in Copenhagen, arriving in Rosyth on June 8, 1945, with plans of refitting her for her to serve as an auxiliary tanker for the British Pacific Fleet. By the time the refit was complete, the war was over. However, she served into the 1950s as a tanker. Taking from Dodson and Kant, as already noted, the UK had undertaken to pass unwanted vessels onto France to make up for her being snubbed at Potsdam. Thus, on December 31, 1945, the Board of the Admiralty approved the transfer of Z-5, Z-6, Z-25, Z-31, T-11, T-20, T-23, T-28, T-108, U-2518, and U-2384. The latter two nominally on loan. U-2326 was swapped for U-2348 before delivery to France. The formal offer was made on January 3, 1946, and except the old T-108, which was rejected, all were handed over a few weeks later. Other smaller craft were handed over as well, tugs, minesweepers, and the like. Other nations like the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway felt they were due some vessels, but it was a bit difficult to find everything everyone wanted. So a total of 21 R-boats were given to Denmark and 9 to the Netherlands, with France receiving 16 and 13 to Norway. I'd like to remind everyone that we will cover the U-boats at a future date, but let's check out another Axis power, the Italians and the Regia Marina. Now, the Regia Marina was in an interesting position, as in 1943, the Italian government had torn away from their German allies to turn to the invading Allied powers, and with that, a period of co-belligerency with the Allied powers began. However, for a vast majority of the remainder of the Second World War, the major surface vessels of the Regia Marina were inactive in Allied-controlled ports, notably the remaining battleships of the Littorio class, Italia and Vittorio Veneto, with their sister Roma being sunk by German-guided bombs in September 1943. To stray away from the complex negotiations, the Italian government signed a peace treaty in Paris in 1947, which came into effect on September 15th, in which the once powerful Italian Navy was soon to be broken up, with the Allied powers such as France, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and of course the United States, at least according to the treaty, were to receive ships. Under the provisions of the treaty, the Italian Navy would retain 2 battleships, the 2 Andrea Doria-class ships, 4 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 13 torpedo boats, 20 corvettes, 30 minesweepers, 8 smaller boats, and a range of auxiliary vessels. Excess vessels beyond those limits were to be placed at the disposal of the nations previously mentioned. The vessels that were to be handed over needed to be fully equipped, in operational condition, including a full outfit of armament stores, and complete with onboard spare parts and all necessary technical data. The big question to answer is what ship everyone wanted. Well, other nations like Greece and Yugoslavia wanted smaller vessels like destroyers, with Greece desiring 2 light cruisers with a third for cannibalization, while Yugoslavia got several torpedo boats. Now, France received some of Italy's more interesting vessels of the Capitani Romani class, like Attilo Regolo, Pompeo Magno, Scipio Africano, and some other smaller craft. The Soviets received the elderly battleship Giulio Cesare, even though their ambitions earlier were for them to receive a Littorio-class ship. They did receive other ships like cruisers, submarines, and destroyers, something you can hear about in my video on Soviet war prizes. Now, the Americans and British were very eager to get their hands on the Littorio class, with the British to receive Vittorio Veneto and the United States to receive Littorio, and of course smaller craft. The British had some consideration for reactivation of the Italian ship, as their fleet was going to be rather elderly by 1947, with Vanguard, of course, being the newest battleship. But as we learned in my Littorio class video, Vittorio Veneto would be scrapped. Taking from Dodson and Kahn again, the only real initial British interest was in Vittorio Veneto, and during the early months of 1946, discussions took place as to whether to actually take her, and if so, to what purpose. Commissioning was not ruled out, especially with the cost of bringing her up to British standards was less than the potential outlay for modernizing the 1920s built battleships HMS Nelson and Rodney, which was still under consideration at this time. Subsequently, the MTBs MS-72, MS-73, and MS-74 were added to the list for short-term use in trials before being given to France. Due to a variety of complicated reasons, the Italians didn't want to part with any of these vessels, especially their modern battleships, with them delaying as long as possible to give them to the Allied powers. Both the USA and the UK were entirely willing to waiver their share of the spoils if the Italians agreed to scrap them or put them to civilian use, with talks of Vittorio Veneto being used as a target ship. Taking from Dodson and Kant, the USA made its announcement on October 5th, stating that it wished its allocations of vessels to be scrapped and utilized as a contribution to the continued recovery of the Italian economy. However, at this point, the list of which nation would receive what had not been made available to Italy, and while the British had now made a decision in principle to waive for scrap all but Vittorio Veneto and 3 of the MTBs, no announcement was yet forthcoming. One concern over giving up the battleship was that the Soviets might then raise the idea of a swap of one of the now-to-be scrapped Littorios for their ancient Cesare. The Italians would take their time in scrapping Vittorio Veneto in Italia, hopefully to delay it as long as possible, as to possibly retain the 2 battleships, at least for training purposes. Nevertheless, they were broken up in the 1950s, with the Soviets asking for the possible swap of the unwanted modern battleships. With that, by the end of October, the British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, recommended to the Prime Minister that all but 3 of the MTBs would be kept by the Italians and scrapped, with the equivalent to Vittorio Veneto scrap yield handed over to the UK. This was agreed to with Italy on October 31st, the terms making it clear that all vessels were to be scrapped or sunk by June 15, 1948, and that Italy would not invoke the UK's decision in seeking any similar concession from France or Greece. The agreement provided for the delivery of 20,000 tons of scrap steel sold to the UK at cost price, which wasn't complete until 1952. Still, in May 1948, takeover of the MTBs was also waived, meaning the UK's entire allocation of Italian ships had now been renounced. Thus, the UK only received scrap from the Italians. Finally, we'll go to the Far East and her last major Axis power, Japan. Starting with Dodson and Kant, because they're premier authority on the subject, the Potsdam Declaration had determined that the Japanese military forces shall be completely disarmed. To implement this policy, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, issued on September 21st a U.S. initial post-surrender policy for Japan, which stated that Japan's ground, air, and naval forces shall be disarmed and disbanded, and the naval vessel shall be surrendered and shall be disposed of as required by SCAP. As in Germany, it was agreed that all submarines should be sunk. A bit of a spoiler for future videos, sorry. However, smaller vessels should be divided between the UK, USA, USSR, and China. SCAP decreed on April 2, 1946, that all larger vessels should be destroyed, as should all wrecks in shallow waters. This means ships like Nagato and Sakawa should be destroyed, something you can learn about in my American Spoils of War video, link in the description. Technically interesting submarines like I-202 were examined, and there was thought of giving her to the UK, but that would make the USR desire a similar vessel, so she was sunk, along with the other submarines, which were done at the direction of the British, including some U-boats, a story for another time perhaps. Like with the German fleet, decisions on the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy were made by drawing lots. The remaining vessels were divided into equal lots. On February 27, 1947, representatives proceeded to Tokyo to begin the drawing, which occurred in several phases, with each nation receiving roughly the same number of each type of vessel at the end of the day. Vessels that were won by the various nations would be brought by Japanese crews to nominated ports, accompanied by transports to repatriate Japanese personnel. There were some adjustments with the Dominions, and they would receive some smaller craft, but nothing too much. In June, the first lots were drawn, where the UK received the destroyers Kusunoki, Hagi, and Take, the escorts Kaibokan, numbers 8, 32, and 55, and Fuke, and Habuto. In the July draw, the UK received the destroyers Sumure, Maki, and Yukaze, and the escorts Kaibokans, numbers 16, 27, 60, and 126, and Kanawa. In the draw in August, they received this destroyer, as I literally can't pronounce it, the escorts Kaikobans numbers 29, 154, 156, 160, and 217, and Kurashi in the transport 19. The fourth and final batch was in September 1947, where the UK received the torpedo boat Hatsukari, the mine layers Kiyosai and Wakataka, the submarine chaser 21, and the minesweeper W102, a vessel that should have been given to the UK already, as she was laid down for the UK and Hong Kong, but was completed by the Japanese. These vessels were going to Singapore, as that was the port chosen by the UK. As was previously mentioned, the UK didn't really have any interest in long-term use of these vessels, especially with these Japanese examples. So after the first two batches, it was decided the other two batches should stay in Japan for scrapping. There was some issue with this, as the scrapping currently taking place in Singapore didn't help the scrap iron shortage in the UK, with some hoping they could be taken back to the UK. But in most cases, the vessels were scrapped locally. Although the UK didn't receive a lot of flashy ships like the US or the Soviet Union did, they nevertheless received some useful vessels and/or scrap that was very useful to a nation following such a devastating conflict like the Second World War. I think the next video in this series will be a video on the submarines, covering where they all went, or maybe just the U-boats, because it could get long. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.